So welcome, everybody. I'm Nancy Hazard. I'm with Greening Greenfield, and I'm part of a group of people who are focusing on building native habitat everywhere to sustain life on Earth and address the climate and biodiversity crisis. So I want to introduce the other people, members of our group. Maybe when I say your name, you can wave or something. So there's Dorothea Sotiris. Hi, Dorothea. Elizabeth Erickson, who's, where I don't see her at the moment. If you can wave, Elizabeth. Oh, there you are, down at the bottom. Okay. And then Mary Westervelt, if you could wave, Mary. So thank you all. This is the third talk of our Transforming Our Lawn series, and but it's our first Zoom event to accommodate our speakers, Charlie and Julia, and their new baby, Isla, who may appear at some point. I want to reiterate a little bit about who Greening Greenfield is, who is putting on this event. Our goals are to fulfill the concept of sustainability, which is where environmental justice, economic vitality, and economic quality are all addressed at the same time. Sustainability, however, is not about maintaining the status quo. To get there, among other things, we need to address, as I mentioned before, the biodiversity and climate crisis, and we need to embrace regeneration and wilding. And that's what our Transforming Our Lawn series is all about, is transforming from places that are food deserts, like our lawns, to wildlife banquets for everybody and every living thing. And our vision, Greening Greenfield's pollinator vision, is, as I mentioned before, is to create native habitat everywhere. A review of our schedule. First, Mary Westervelt is going to introduce our new garden website for about 5 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for some clarifying questions after that. And then Charlie and Julia will take it from there and talk for about 45 minutes, followed by questions and answers. And so please put your any of your questions in the chat box. That would be great as we go forth. And we aim to wrap up before 8 o'clock tonight. Okay. Any questions at this point? Okay, fabulous. So the Greening is a new garden website. The idea of this website of having a place where all the pollinator gardens in Greenfield, all the public ones, are visible, was conceived over 4 years ago, just before FERCog held its first gatherings in Greenfield about planning for pollinator corridors. About a year ago, Elizabeth Erickson and Mary Westervelt picked up the project, and they've been working on it for over a year, adding gardens, photographs, lots of information, and they've transformed it into this really beautiful, inspirational, and educational resource, which we hope will inspire people to build beauty and native habitat everywhere, and to volunteer to work in our public spaces. So our new website is called Park by Park and Yard by Yard, creating a pollinator corridor in Greenfield. So Mary, please, what it looks like.
So our website, I'll try to zoom in on various bits so that you can see what I'm talking about. Our website is big on pictures, and we highlight all the different parks, the public parks in Greenfield that have been worked on that feature native plants. We start with an introduction, and since you've been coming to these presentations and you listen to Nancy, you know all this information, but people who might just be looking around for the first time will get an introduction to why we care about pollinators and why we care about a way of gardening that supports them. I have to move over here so that I can go to our gardens. We've highlighted the various gardens that have been worked on by groups, Greening Greenfield and other people. And I'll just click on one of those, the John Zahn Pollinator Garden. So this page, like all of them, will have some information about the garden, when it was planted, whose vision it was, how it's maintained. And then we've got some pictures of the garden going in, the garden as it is now, some of those pollinators that we're trying to attract, and then different seasons. We have autumn, we have winter. And at the bottom of each page, if there's an opportunity for volunteers, there's information about who you would contact to volunteer to help either with maintaining the gardens, or in this particular case, we're going to be planting some shrubs and trees, and we will be glad to have help of volunteers planting and later for watering and maintenance. Now, Nancy mentioned pollinator corridor and FERCOG, and Elizabeth and I, when we started this, we were focusing on these gardens, but it slowly became clear to us that they were part of something called a pollinator corridor, and that FERCOG, the Franklin County Regional Council of Governments, had actually put together a regional plan for supporting pollinators. And then they'd made it specific for Franklin County as well. So we thought focusing on the information that they have seemed really important for this website. So we've highlighted what they have put in about where there are natural pollinator corridors in Greenfield, in and around Greenfield, and then put in some more information. What do pollinators need? And then in particular, we wanted to make ways where gardeners could take the information that's on this website and work it into their own gardens. So we have a little selection here called Make Your Home Garden a Stepping Stone in the Pollinator Corridor. And we're talking about how you do that, planting, taking care of the land. And then at the bottom of that, we connect it to Doug Tallamy's effort to start what he's calling Homegrown National Park, which he envisions as having even more acreage than some of the largest national parks in the US, and providing a good way to support pollinators. So we hope you'll explore the website. In the chat, I've put a link to get you to the website so you can poke around on your own. And I've also put Elizabeth's email address and mine so you could send questions to us directly. If there are any immediate questions, if you put them in the chat, I'll try to get to them right away. So.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Mary. And I hope that everyone will go and poke around and really enjoy that website. So moving on, I now want to introduce Charlie Eisman and Julia Blythe. So when Charlie and Julia agreed to talk, we were all thrilled because we'd heard about how they had transformed their yard without completely killing their lawn, as one of the major things that Owen Wormser had talked about, so they could start with a clean slate. So they started with their lawn and built on it, and we wanted to learn how they had done that. Charlie and Julia are also amazing naturalists, and we wanted to hear what they now are seeing after this 10-year effort to transform what they described as a totally unlandscaped barren lawn into a yard with fruit and nut trees, berry bushes, and vegetable gardens interspersed with wild meadow. Julia is an avid gardener interested in native and edible plants, and she's worked with permaculturalists as well as with natural history museums with their collections on everything from birds to lichens. Charlie is into bugs. I knew about his encyclopedic book on leaf miners, which is a type of insect, but I did not know that this was his second book and that he has published over 60 scientific papers on insect natural history. For the past 20 years, he's been doing plant wildlife inventories throughout New England, and he keeps a blog called Bug Tracks. He's fascinated with insect lives and the relationship of native plants and insects. And this has led him to discover a number of insects that are new to science. So Charlie and Julia.
So turning a barren lawn into thriving habitat. And we have a picture of a little family of turkeys in our yard here, just as just to mention that although there's kind of a pollinator focus here, insects are so much more than just pollinators, and they're, along with plants, they're really the base of the food web. And we've tallied over 100 species of birds and mammals and reptiles and amphibians in our yard, and all of them really either eat insects or eat something that eats insects. And beyond that, I mean, every insect species is fascinating and worthy of our interest and admiration and respect and protection in their own right. So we will talk about pollinators some, but all of the insects coming to our yard are equally welcome, really. So, oh, what's happening here? I have to click somewhere. There we go. Okay, so this is what our yard looked like here in Northfield when we bought our house in, it was actually August of 2013 when we moved in, and then I took this series of pictures. But I'm going to show you a series of before and after shots that show that the exact same frame exactly 6 years later. So this is our front yard. It's got nothing in it, just a lawn and an arborvitae hedge there. But 6 years later, we've planted some perennials along the driveway, but we've packed in as many fruit trees and berry bushes as we can. And there's a vegetable garden here with a grape arbor.
And we have allowed a small area of grass so that we can walk to our front door.
Right. And so really, we didn't do anything to kill our lawn. We just let it grow, and we mowed the places that we walk regularly.
And then we pulled out things that were coming up that were unwelcome. So there were some invasive species and some trees that sprouted that would have crowded out our fruit trees. So we pulled those up, and then occasionally we added plugs of native plants or various shrubs that we were able to acquire.
Yeah. So another view of our front yard, before shot there, just empty lawn. There was really nothing on this side, I guess. But now this is standing at the north end of our yard. There's this big patch of a native grass called deer tongue grass here. There's a little pawpaw patch here, some plums and cherries, and then a bunch of ostrich ferns we planted there that we harvest some fiddleheads.
And we have spice bushes along the front of the house, kind of in the shade. They get just morning sun, and some various spring ephemerals underneath them. And
then this is looking into the west, the backyard from our driveway, where when we had just been there for a few weeks, we had a tiny little vegetable garden with our first starter compost pile there. But 6 years later, we had these rows of raspberries and a hoop house and a vegetable garden down there, some peach trees over here, asparagus patch.
Goldenrod.
Yeah, and then just a closer view of our vegetable garden there with the hoop house in the background. You can see, although we have orderly rows of kale and tomatoes and corn and so forth, we also have selectively let some weeds grow, like this amazing tall blue lettuce. It's not hurting anything by being there. And it's a pretty neat plant to have around. So back to the front yard. Now we're at the south end of our front yard. There was this this beautiful ash tree when we moved in, which unfortunately we had to cut down because it was the only place we could put a solar panel. We have a perfectly east-west facing roof, and we wanted south-facing solar panels, so that's what we have there. And in this view, you can't see much of what's going on because we thought it would be fun to have a little, like, Julia's from Ohio, and we thought it would be nice to have this little, like, Ohio prairie along the arborvitae hedge in one spot. So we planted a few seeds of different things, including wingstem, which turns out to be pretty invasive in our yard. So we ended up pulling all of that out. And so this is just last year what that same area looks like. So now you can see that there's some apple and pear trees there, some currants and gooseberries and
more goldenrod, and there's some coneflowers and other astery species in there.
And then this is sort of the side yard where there's the shed that came with the house. Julia was just starting to build this chicken house by the old apple tree. That old apple tree and that black cherry and the ash tree that we cut down were basically the only trees in the yard. So 6 years later, the chickens have a more elaborate setup, and there's goldenrod and more tall blue lettuce and black raspberries and other things.
And this woodland sunflower over here.
And the chickens have a nice little stinging nettle patch right in the middle there that they don't eat. This is looking into the backyard from where the chicken run is now. And then now standing inside the chicken run, there's a big wild meadow there that we've planted various native willows and azaleas and viburnums, a few other things, and just lots of goldenrod filling in around that nice big Jerusalem artichoke patch there. And so those turkeys in the title slide were actually in this, our little mowed path that's right next to the chicken house and chicken run. And pretty much every year, turkeys show up to commune with the chickens, their cousins in our yard.
And you can see black raspberries out of focus in the foreground here that we've let that patch establish itself. So we didn't plant that, the birds did.
Yeah, so all of these things have been planted by birds and wind for the most part. So this, when Julia was cleaning our chimney in October, she took a couple of nice bird's eye views of our front yard, so you can get a better sense of how meadowy it really is. It's hard to make out the mowed paths, but there's one here and one kind of through there and around there.
And there's service berries in there too.
And the other side of the front yard, so there's me. And yeah, it just looks like this wild jungle, but there's 4 pear trees and 4 apple trees just in this area, and some persimmons and gummies and honeyberries and other things.
And we had let this little ash stand develop around a bird bath. The birds were really enjoying that, and we have since thinned that out a little bit so that those ashes don't get so tall that they shade out our vegetable garden here. Yeah, the birds were really enjoying that, and it kind of made up for that ash tree we cut down in the beginning.
Yeah, although we cut it down, its progeny lives on.
And one more note before we move on about like adding herbaceous native plants. Since we didn't mow it all, sometimes the grass got really long and just smothered itself. And so those were nice places to opportunistically insert plugs of native plants. And so sometimes we could either scrape that away and put, if there's bare soil, we in a few places seeded some native plants in, but mostly we used plugs either from nurseries, or in a few cases we planted seeds in pots inside and then planted the plants out. Because we weren't starting with a blank slate, the seeds I think might have struggled getting through the turf. So using plugs enabled them to get a good foothold and compete with the grass.
And at no point during this process did we really consciously think about like, how can we make our yard more attractive to pollinators? We just kind of took for granted that if we tried to maximize the species diversity and structural diversity of our yard, that there would be a diversity and abundance of insects who would visit the flowers. And I'm standing here next to one of our plum trees in that you can't see it, but there's just a deafening cloud of bees and flies that I'm basking in there. Here's a picture Julia took that captures a few of these, but you really have to be there to appreciate how many bugs there really are swarming around the plum blossoms. And as you can see, that it worked. They're really pollinating our plums and doing a great job. And I haven't really tried to systematically inventory all the bugs that are visiting our plum blossoms, but one day we're walking by this meadowsweet, which the wind had blown in a seed, and this just sprung up on its own at the edge of our yard. And we were so blown away by all the different bugs that were on the flowers of this meadowsweet that we stood there for half an hour taking pictures of all of them. So I'm going to show you a few of them and talk about what their habitat requirements are besides just flowers to visit. And this is relevant because meadowsweet or spirea is in the rose family, as are peaches, plums, pears, apples, cherries, raspberries, blackberries, and they all have similar flowers and are visited by a similar suite of insects. So this is a minor bee. It's one of several families of bees that nest in the ground. So they need disturbed, bare, exposed, sandy soil to nest in. And we don't have a lot of that in our yard, but there is kind of at the edge of our property, there's a more rocky place where some fill was dumped. And I think that could be where this bee was nesting. But in any case, you need some of that around somewhere nearby to have those kinds of bees around. This is a yellow-faced bee, which instead of nesting in the ground, nests in hollow stems, and it doesn't hollow stems out itself. In this case, this one is peeking out of a dead raspberry cane that we had pruned, and the tunnel in it was made by another kind of bee called a small carpenter bee. And so this bee is reusing that other bee's old nest. And so all of the solitary bees, which is all bees other than honeybees and bumblebees, have these individual nest cells they make either in the ground or hollow stems or some other cavity. And they make a ball of pollen and nectar that they collect, and they lay an egg on that, and then they seal up that cell. And that's all the provisions for one bee larva. This is a kind of dance fly, which the adults are predatory on other insects in addition to visiting flowers, and the larvae live in leaf litter. So if you're raking up all your leaf litter and burning it or sending it off to the landfill, you're not only depriving yourself of great mulch and compost, but also depriving flies like these and numerous other kinds of insects of critical habitat. This square-headed wasp is a solitary wasp so all wasps other than yellow jackets and bald-faced hornets are solitary, and apart from the parasitoid wasps, the solitary wasps are like the solitary bees in that they all have their own particular kind of place that they make nests, but instead of making a ball of pollen and nectar, they have a particular kind of insect that they specialize in hunting and stinging to paralyze, and then stuffing a bunch of those in the nest cell and laying an egg on it, just like a bee does with its ball of pollen and nectar. So these square-headed wasps actually nest in, they're another thing that nests in hollow stems. And this is a parasitic wasp that lays its eggs in the nests of other wasps like that square-headed wasp that nest in hollow stems, and then its larvae eat the larvae and the nest provisions of the host wasps. A scarab beetle whose larvae develop in rotting wood. So if you clear out all of the decaying matter and rotting wood from your yard, there's no habitat for beetles like these. And longhorn beetles have larvae that bore in dead or dying trees, so not as far gone as what the scarab beetles are living in. But so having all kinds of dead and decaying stuff and at different stages of decay is going to maximize the diversity of insects in your yard. This is a mason wasp, which nests in old, at least sometimes in old galleries of longhorn beetle larvae in dead trees, and then they hunt caterpillars and stuff them into the tunnels and lay eggs on those for their young. And our last meadowsweet visitor here is a sawfly, which is a kind of wasp-like insect that has caterpillar-like larvae, and all sawflies eat leaves of various plants as larvae. So, and they're generally very host specific. So the more kinds of plants you have, the more kinds of sawflies you'll have. In 2020, the year that we didn't leave our yard very much, I kept track of all the sawfly larvae I found in our yard, and there were over 50 species. And so this is back to our plum tree here, just to mention this little day-flying moth that I found visiting the plum blossoms. Reminds me to tell you about this British study that was just published 2 weeks ago, where they looked at pollinators on blackberries and discovered that even though there are so many different insects all over blackberry flowers during the day, it's actually moths at night that are doing most of the pollination. And just like sawflies, moths have caterpillars that eat plants. And then they tend to be host specific and have different plants that they eat. So if you have this idea in your head that there are good bugs that pollinate plants and there are bad bugs that eat plants, that is a false dichotomy. And you need to restructure your worldview a bit to accommodate all this that's going on. Not to mention that things that are eating plants are not necessarily bad anyway. I mean, they're helping to regulate populations of plants by keeping any one thing from becoming too abundant, everything eating each other. And just one other pollinator I'll mention here. This is one of 6 species of bumblebees I've photographed in our yard, and this one happens to have been on an oregano flower, but it is a state-listed threatened species, the yellow-banded bumblebee. And if you read the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program's fact sheet you'll see that we don't really know exactly what its habitat requirements are, but it's pretty clear that the reason it's in decline is that most people's yards don't look like ours does. Okay, and the rest of this talk, I'm just going to introduce you to some of the plants that are in our yard now, many of which people often think of as weeds, and just talk about some of the insects, mostly herbivorous insects that depend on these specific plants. So milkweed is one that's been getting a lot of press lately. People are concerned that milkweed is disappearing. But the reason milkweed has become more scarce is because people are incessantly mowing and herbiciding, and anywhere that you don't do that, you will very quickly have milkweed. This is a patch of milkweed right next to our driveway.
That just seeded itself.
Yeah, I mean, it just blows in on the wind and those fluff-covered seeds. So this is milkweed coming up in our asparagus patch. This is milkweed coming up in our one of our strawberry patches here. So it's called milkweed for a reason, but we just pull up the ones coming up in our food gardens, and if you boil it for 7 minutes, it becomes a delicious and nutritious edible. You boil it for less than 7 minutes and eat it, you'll wish you'd never been born. So keep that in mind. So milkweed, the reason I'm talking about milkweed, though, of course, is, I mean, the reason people are concerned about milkweed is monarchs, and monarchs don't need milkweed because of the nectar that the flowers provide, although that's nice too, but it's the caterpillars that eat nothing but milkweed leaves. And we, every year since the milkweed showed up, we've had plenty of adult and larval monarchs in our yard, so that's great to see. But monarchs are just one of many kinds of insects that depend on milkweed exclusively. So this is what a monarch egg looks like. They lay single tiny eggs on the undersides of leaves. So these little hairy caterpillars hatching out of this fuzzy egg mass on a milkweed leaf are something else. When they get bigger, they become these shag carpet looking things, and they're called milkweed tussock moths. And that's what the adult looks like. There are also milkweed longhorn beetles. So this longhorn beetle, instead of the larvae boring in wood, they feed on the roots of milkweed plants. The adults also eat milkweed, but feed on the leaves. And they have this special way of doing it where they nip the midrib. They chew into it so that the sticky latex comes out of the midrib and bubbles out. And that means that the tip of the leaf won't have any of that gumming up their mouth parts, so they're able to just munch the tip of the leaf unencumbered. This is a milkweed weevil that has figured out a similar trick. It's severed the midrib there and then ate a big hole in the middle of the leaf. And these weevils also chew on the stems where they lay eggs, and the larvae develop as stem borers or sometimes feeding inside the pods. These are called large milkweed bugs, and they suck on the pods. And they, like monarchs, fly south, if not to Mexico, at least to the extreme southern US. But the monarchs get all the press. Small milkweed bugs are kind of similar looking, but smaller. This one is sucking on milkweed flower buds. These stick around for the winter as adults. You'll see them early in the spring crawling around, and they will suck on other plants while they're waiting for the milkweed to come back up. One last milkweed insect here is these, the splotchy patterns on this leaf are caused by fly larvae known as leaf miners that they're mining because they're actually tunneling between the two epidermises of the leaf. Living out their entire larval lives inside the leaf. And this is what the adult fly looks like. It's just 2 millimeters long. And as Nancy mentioned, I've spent the past 10 years working on a complete guide to leaf miners of North America. So leaf miners figure kind of prominently in this talk. And that this is available only as an ebook because it's so enormous. A few brave souls have printed the whole thing out, but it's not really practical to do that. Anyway, so that's milkweed. But the very first wildflower that came up in our yard when we liberated it from the mowing regime of our predecessors was this daisy fleabane just somewhere in the middle of the front yard. And as soon as I saw that there, I ran over to it to see what leaf miners were on it. And there were 3 different species just on this one individual plant. So there was this one kind of puffy greenish mine that I recognized right away as the work of this moth, Correctipa plantagenicella. But there were 2 others I wasn't so sure about. I knew this was some kind of leaf mining fly in the same family as that milkweed fly. The larvae, when I collected the leaves, the larvae popped out and made these shiny black puparia. And then the adults that emerged about a month later, I sent them to my colleague Owen Lonsdale in Canada, who's a specialist in this family of flies, and he determined that they were a new species. So we named it Phytomyza origeronis. And then, so that the very first plant that came up in our yard had a species unknown to science, and I think that's kind of amazing. And then the third leaf miner was this elongate track along the midrib that when I collected this leaf, I could see there was a little caterpillar inside it, and it was keeping its mind very clean by pushing all of its poop into a neat little pile just outside the entrance. And a few weeks later, I got the adult moth, which it belongs to this very taxonomically difficult group that no one is really studying. And this may also be a species that doesn't have a name yet, but we may not know for a while. Okay, so daisy fleabane, here's another one. Evening primrose, another plant that's just shown up in our yard on its own. There's a lot of it right along the driveway. And right along the driveway there, I often see these beautiful pink moths that are called primrose moths. And that the first time I saw them just on the way to get the mail one day, I ran back inside to Google them and find out what they were. And I learned, like I said, that they're called primrose moths, but also I learned that their larvae bore in the buds and developing fruits of evening primrose. So I kept watching this evening primrose right by the mailbox every day when I'd go to get the mail. And one day I finally saw this caterpillar with its head burrowed in and some yellow mush coming out the other end. So that's what the caterpillars of those beautiful pink moths do. So that they'll also eat the dead flowers, which it's not harming the plant in any way at that point.
But even when it's boring in the bud, that's a great example of like you see damage on your plant, but that's kind of the point of having a native plant is so you can get that beautiful moth.
Exactly. So evening primrose also has a leaf miner, and someone who studies this particular genus of moth asked me if I could raise some for him. So I collected a couple of leaves. Here's the caterpillar in there. And it emerged to spin a cocoon when it was done eating. And this is the adult, it's the genus Mompha. But in that same little vial that I had a few evening primrose leaves in to raise this moth, when the moth emerged, I noticed, so here's the moth here, there were all these other feeding signs on the leaves. And so I looked for the source of these holes in this leaf, and I saw that there's this little poop covered thing here, which turns out to be a beetle larva that's just coating itself in poop to make itself less appetizing to predators. But so I kept that for a while to see what it would turn into. And it took all of the poop off of its back to make this little cocoon in the bottom of the vial, and then pupated. And at that point, I could tell it was a weevil with this long snout. And this is what the adult looked like. And this species is Dietzella zimmermanni, and it was known to, the adults have been found on different plants in the evening primrose family, but no one knew what its larvae looked like or what they did for a living before. So the adults just nibble these little holes in the leaves. But also, in addition to these holes that the weevil larvae were eating, there are these patches where something was, instead of covering its back with poop, was just leaving poop strewn about these feeding patches. So I looked around for the source of that and found this larva, which I recognized as something that would need to burrow into soil to pupate. So I gave it a little jar of soil to burrow into. And a few weeks later, this shiny gold flea beetle popped out. And I sent this to a flea beetle specialist who identified it as a species that had just been named a decade earlier, and its host plant was unknown. And then there was just that one known leaf miner, the Mompha, that I showed you a couple of minutes ago. And so and it makes those long, narrow, linear mines. So when I saw these caterpillars making blotchy mines in the evening primrose, I wondered what the heck those were. So I collected those to raise them. And their larvae came out and spun cocoons, and turned out to be this species Aristotelia isopelta, which is another insect that was known from adults, but its larva and host plant were unknown. So just in the weeds in your yard, there are just really infinite discoveries you can make if you're willing to spend some time putting bugs in jars and keeping an eye on them.
And figuring out what they are when they come out.
Yeah. Stinging nettle, another plant that many people think of as a weed, but we definitely welcome this in our yard. Julia's not such a big fan of having it leaning over the front door from next to the stoop, but other than that, wherever it wants to grow, we're happy to have it. It's a delicious and really nutritious edible in the spring. We put it in soups and make tea out of it. But just sitting there on the front stoop one day, I noticed this egg on one of the leaves, and that is the egg of a caterpillar that hides itself in curled stinging nettle leaves, and its chrysalis is also hidden among the leaves, but the adult is the red admiral. So these are nettle specialist butterflies. Ragweed, definitely not Julia's favorite plant. She gets pretty bad allergies from it, but I like to have some of it around because not only does it have its own leaf mining fly, but it has these beautiful fruit flies that specialize on it, and they hang out on the flowers, and the males do these little dances displaying their fancy wings, and then the females lay eggs in the female flowers of the ragweed, and the larvae develop in the developing fruits. So they at least make there be a little less ragweed the next year by eating the flowers. And there are also these neat stripy beetles that specialize on ragweed. Both the adults and larvae eat the leaves. So these are the eggs of this beetle, and that's the larva. And most beetles don't spin. Most beetles go into the ground to pupate, but these ragweed beetles spin cocoons right on the ragweed foliage. Goldenrod, we have half a dozen or more species of goldenrods that have just blown in on the wind into our yard. And
2 or 3 of which we've planted on
or some
purpose.
additional ones we've planted. I think we might have 9 or so total species.
And goldenrod also often gets the blame for people's allergies, but it's really ragweed, which is wind pollinated, rather than goldenrod, which is insect pollinated.
Yeah, so you really can't be, the only way you could be exposed to goldenrod pollen is if you shove the flowers up your nose. Sometimes people will bump into goldenrod and see pollen blow off it, but that's could be ragweed pollen or some other windborne pollen that has settled on it. The most robust and aggressive goldenrod in our yard is the Canada goldenrod. So that's me standing up, and it's a couple of feet taller than me there. The other goldenrods kind of keep to themselves a little better than the Canada goldenrod does. But there are all kinds of different bugs that depend on goldenrod. There was one spring that I noticed these neatly cut goldenrod stems in our front yard, kind of a beveled edge, and I could see there was a tunnel that was packed with shredded fibers. So I split the stem to see what was going on in there, and clearly something had bored down, and then I guess it plugged that hole on its way down. And this went right down to the ground level. So I realized to figure out what bug was doing this, I would have to dig up the plant. So I dug up this clump with 3 of those cut stems and just put this garbage bag with the plant in our front hall. And I watched it for a month, and 30 different kinds of insects appeared in this bag. And I have a blog post that talks about all of those different bugs that came out of a cubic foot of our lawn. But then finally, after a month, this plume moth emerged, or 3 of them actually, from the 3 stems. And it was the larvae of these plume moths that actually did the pruning of the goldenrod stems. You're going to say something? No. Okay, so the goldenrod stem sign that I think more people notice is these spherical galls. So a gall is a plant deformity that's caused by another organism, often an insect, living inside it. And the gall provides the shelter and all of the food that the developing insect needs. And in the fall, you'll see, or in the winter, you'll see these galls with very precise holes drilled into them. And this is from downy woodpeckers that know the exact spot to go and go after the larva that's inside the skull. So the larva develops, I mean, it does its feeding right in the center of the gall. I split open one of these woodpecker pecked ones to see the internal structure. But when the larva is done feeding, it bores a tunnel to just under the skin, and then it overwinters right there. So it's ready in the spring to emerge from the gall. And the way it does that is this balloon pops out of its forehead and busts open this trap door on the gall.
So that's a fly.
Yeah, with just this giant airbag head. And then this airbag recedes into its forehead and it never comes out again for the rest of its life. And this little suture here is where the airbag goes. But these flies are about the size of deer flies.
But they don't bite. I mean,
No, all
are-
they do is make goldenrod gulls. And the females have these special ovipositor sheaths. They have a piercing ovipositor for injecting eggs into goldenrod stems. So there are somewhat similar stem gulls on goldenrod, which you can tell there's something different because they have this pre-made exit hole, which is then plugged with poop or frass. And this is the work of a moth called the goldenrod gull moth. And usually the gulls are much narrower. This is a more typical shape. And when you see them in the winter, they'll already have that poop is gone and there's just a hole there. And that's because they emerge as adults in the late summer or fall, and they actually overwinter as eggs just laid near goldenrod plants. So also on goldenrods and asters, there are just tons of different caterpillars you can find on them, but this is the most glorious of them all, I think, the brown-hooded owlet moth. So that's what the adult looks like, a little less exciting. And that in addition to free-living caterpillars on goldenrods and asters, there are different leaf folding and leaf tying ones, and there's this one struck my interest. This was on a smooth aster in our backyard. This larva had tied together several series of leaves and made a continuous silk tunnel leading down through them. So I stuck that in a jar to see who it was, and this caterpillar came out and it turned into this lovely little moth. So this is the smooth aster that was that caterpillar's host plant. And this leaf miner that I found in our front yard on that same smooth aster turned out to be another new species. This one, Owen and I named Ophiomya parda. Parda is the Latin name for leopard, and it's a reference to these spots in the leaf mine. Leopards being spotty. This larva always spaces out its poop in these long spaces, well-spaced poop dots, and then when it's done feeding, it hides its puparium on the underside of the leaf, so it looks like the mine is empty. And that's what the adult looks like. And this is a picture of me celebrating the first kilowatt hour that our solar panels generated. But the reason I stuck this in here is that just within this frame, both of those two new species of flies, the type specimens were collected there. So really, you don't need a very large space to go discovering new species of insects in your yard. So that's it for the herbaceous plants I was going to talk about. And I just have a few woody plants.
I was going to interject. Doug Ptolemy promotes oaks as being the most diverse woody plant you could possibly have, and we agree. And certainly goldenrods and asters serve that function for the herbaceous things. So if you could only plant one group of plants or something, goldenrods and asters should be it in terms of supporting the most diversity.
Yeah, because they have, in addition to all these herbivorous insects that eat the leaves, they also have flowers that, like all those things in the rose family, are just open for all the generalist insects to come to and visit. They're not complicated things that only certain bees can get into, so that they'll attract all different kinds of insects. So the first woody plant I'll mention here is this wild grape that was just growing along our driveway. And it has feeding sign of Japanese beetles, that those leaves riddled with holes, but I noticed a slightly different feeding pattern on this one leaf, so I flipped it over to see who was there. It was this little caterpillar, and I flipped over another leaf and found an older one of the same caterpillar. It's just gorgeous caterpillars, and they turn out to be the larvae of this moth called the beautiful wood nymph, which kind of looks like bird poop. I think it's supposed to be unappetizing, but somehow also beautiful. Grape also has its own suite of leaf miners, including this one that when it's done mining, it cuts out a little oval piece of the leaf, which then becomes this portable case that it wears like a turtle shell. So this is hanging by a strand of silk over our driveway from a grapevine that's in a tree next to the driveway. When they hit the ground or a branch, they walk along wearing this leaf piece, and then they attach it to some substrate and pupate inside it. This is the caterpillar peeking out of its little turtle shell, and the adult. There's several species in that family, Heliozelidae, that mine in grape and Virginia creeper leaves. And then there's one species that instead of mining, it makes these galls, just kind of flat, wrinkly things along the veins of grape leaves. But it still does the same thing when it's ready to pupate, that it cuts out an oval chunk of the gall and it walks away wearing that, looking for a place to pupate. Most other galls on grapes are caused by midges, and those particular lumpy galls on the tendrils and leaves have these little orange larvae that pop out and burrow into the ground, and then little orange midges come out of the ground a few weeks later, or maybe the next year. And there was a Canadian study several years ago where they analyzed data from trapping insects all across the continent, and they came to the conclusion that 20% of all animal species on Earth are gall midges. So there's a lot of diversity there. This is so everything I've talked about so far is a plant that just the seeds blew into our yard on the wind, or birds planted them. But this is a spice bush that we planted right in front of our house. When you see a folded spice bush leaf like this, you can peel it apart and see a caterpillar hiding inside that has caused that fold. And it has these big fake eyes on its back, but this is its actual head over here.
Or sometimes you just see the silk that it left behind if it's already vacated that leaf.
Yeah, so this shiny stuff here is this bed of silk that it's laid down, and as the silk dries, it contracts and draws the leaf in until it's folded neatly in half. These caterpillars also have, if you disturb them in just the right way, they have this forked fake tongue that pops out. It looks just like a snake tongue. It's pretty amazing. So this is an empty leaf that just has the bed of silk inside. The younger caterpillars look like bird poop. This is a common strategy in insects. And the adult is, we know, as the spice bush swallowtail. there are also spicebush silk moths, although, so the giant silk moths, a lot of them aren't as host specific as most of the insects we're talking about. And actually the giant silk or the spicebush silk moths in our yard are all on black cherry, it seems like. There are different populations seem to have different preferences. But so they also roll up leaves, but they do this just when they're making their cocoons, and they stay on all winter because they wind silk around the leaf stalk and around the stem, so it stays attached after all the other leaves have dropped off the plant.
And oh, we'll keep going.
So this is a little caterpillar of this moth on a cherry leaf, and that's the adult. So it's also known as the Promethea moth.
I just wanted to mention that the spicebush swallowtails completely defoliated our spice bushes multiple years in a row, and they are doing fine. So even though like I was a little worried at first, like, hey, wait, leave a couple leaves for the plant to survive, they seem to be doing fine. So another example of native plants and native bugs being able to get along fine despite our concerns.
Yeah, and so that is, again, that's why we plant native plants, because non-native plants, they don't have all of the bugs from their native range around to eat them. So you'll just have, it's like having a statue in your yard, basically. If you like a forsythia, doesn't have much eating its leaves, but the plants have evolved along with these bugs eating their leaves, and they in general are totally fine if they get defoliated every year. Another underappreciated plant for sure, staghorn sumac, another one that the birds have planted around the edges of our yard, and these fruits hang on all winter into even early summer, but towards the end of the winter we'll often have flocks of robins and bluebirds, woodpeckers and other things going after the fruits.
And this is a species that we have edited because it would maybe take over our entire yard if we let it. And so there are places where we say, all right, here's a sumac patch stand, and other places where we're preferring to keep it more as a meadow, and so we'll cut those or pull them.
It's also a great edible. In addition to, I think a lot of people know you can take the fruits and stick them in water and it'll make this delicious lemony tea, but you can also, the young shoots, if you peel off the young bark, there's just this delicious little succulent tender thing inside that you can either just munch, or we sometimes put those in sushi. But so sumac has several interesting things that are specialists on it. Usually when you see a rolled sumac leaf like this, that is the work of the larva of this moth called the sumac leaf roller. It's really amazing pattern on those wings. There are also these strange apple-like galls that come out of the midribs of the leaflets, and they can be very a little bit alarmingly numerous sometimes, and they really, when they get this red blush on them in the fall, they really do look like apples. But if you open them up, you'll find that they're chock full of aphids, and that's who cause these galls. And they actually, and all that white stuff is just this waxy secretion they make to protect themselves. But then most aphids have this two-part life cycle where they spend part of the year on one host plant, and then they fly to something else to lay eggs on where they overwinter. And these sumac gall aphids overwinter on mosses. And something I want to mention about aphids, I said that thing about the beginning about good bugs and bad bugs, and how it's not a clear dichotomy usually. So I think most people are probably in agreement that aphids are bad bugs, but all of these insects that suck on plants, or many of them, and aphids are definitely one of them that do, they take in way more sugar than they need. So their poop is this sweet substance known as honeydew, and that is a great food source for all kinds of flies and bees and wasps that are also pollinators, and that can help to, if there are gaps in flowering times of different plants in your yard, the honeydew from aphids and other bugs that suck on plants can help keep those bugs going. One other thing about sumac is it has a pithy center in the stem, and we cut a bunch of, when we were just getting rid of extra sumac around our yard, we repurposed it as stakes for our pea trellises in our vegetable garden. And I remembered how, because sumac has this pithy center, it's used by small carpenter bees, which I mentioned toward the beginning. And so I went and checked our pea stakes, and sure enough, each one had this hole going down into the pith. And you can maybe just barely see there's a little shiny green face in there peeking out that this bee was shy, but there was one in there. And the next spring, all of the stakes were piled at the edge of the garden, and I went to cut one open just to see what the internal structure of these nests looked like. And I hadn't researched these bees, and I didn't realize they in fact overwinter as adults inside their old nests. So every one of these stakes just had a bee hanging out on the inside. And there were other bugs that took advantage of their burrows, like there was a little jumping spider in an overwintering chamber there, and I found a sawfly that was something that eats sheep sorrel, but it had gone into this sumac tunnel just to overwinter and pupate. So in addition to sumac, raspberry, elderberry, those are the ones that come to mind at the moment. Woody plants with pithy centered stems that are great for these small carpenter bees and other things that nest in hollow stems. And this is one of the small carpenter bees on a bloodroot flower in our little spring ephemeral garden on the east side of our house. And our bloodroot is up right now, which means these bees are starting to come out right now too. This is an arrowwood viburnum, which is a plant that we've planted a few that they did not come into our yard on their own, but the viburnum flowers, like the asters and roses, they are visited by a plethora of generalist pollinating insects or flower visiting insects. And for 10 years, Julia and I did a survey of gall making and leaf mining insects on Nantucket, and there was one that we found the first year we were there that it took us 5 years to figure out the whole life cycle of this bug and raise it. But what it does is it lays its egg on an arrowwood or other viburnum leaf in July, and the larva mines in the leaf for a little while, and then it ends up going down the midrib. This is what the larva looks like at this stage, but it's feeding internally its whole life. It mines down the midrib, down the petiole, and behind the bark, and it then mines behind the bark, overwinters in there, and continues mining under the bark in the spring. Sometimes you can see this mine in the bark, but more often it's deeper and there's no external evidence of it. But then it makes this little, it cuts out a semicircular flap in the bark when it's done feeding, and it spins its cocoon on the underside of that flap. So once we learned that, we spent a few hours gathering these little bark flaps, and we were able to get 3 of these adult moths from those, and that turned out to be a new species, which is now named Marmora viburnella. But there was a non-native species of viburnum called highbush cranberry. It's a native species, but this is the non-native subspecies that some bird planted at the edge of our yard. And in 2020, when I was, in addition to inventorying the sawfly larvae of our yard, I was checking every plant for leaf mines. And this was one of the 212 leaf mining species I found in our yard that season. in the high bush cranberry. So there's the leaf mine and going down the petiole into the stem there.
And so a native insect using a non-native plant.
Yeah, and that can happen. That's not infrequent that will happen if the non-native plant is in the same genus as the insect's normal host. So even multiflora rose, there are native rose feeding insects that feed on it. You'll find more of them on the native roses, but some of them have adapted to like 10 minutes in.
Maybe we should skip to
Wait, we're trying to finish by 8, is that right?
questions.
With questions. Yeah, we're in great shape.
I'm anxious because I'm hearing my baby cry.
Anyway, so viburnums also have these lovely little hornworms that feed on them. And those are the larvae of hummingbird moths, which we see much more often as adults, that they especially like to visit bee balm flowers or bergamot. Okay, I think I just have 3 tree species I'm going to talk about here. So black cherry, this crazy sinusoidal pattern here is what this particular sawfly larva always does. The egg is inserted in the edge of the leaf, and then it starts out making this, what the person who first described this in the scientific literature 100 years ago described as a curious winding slit. So I raised this one, collected it, and after a while it started eating more randomly. I had several of them that started bonking heads at the edges of the leaves. Spun cocoons, and then most sawflies have a single generation per year. So this was in June that this larva spun its cocoon, and then the following spring, this adult finally emerged. You want to say something? No. Okay.
Don't worry, somebody is watching our baby. I'm not just ignoring it.
So this is this spotty pattern on this cherry leaf tells you that something has been sucking on the underside of the leaf, and these little white snowflake patches are where the green has been sucked away. And so if you flip over the leaf, in this case, you find these lovely, this is another insect that I think most people think of as pests, but I just think that they're beautiful. They're called lace bugs. They make these neat little eggs that kind of look like little bowling pins. And then the adults are just these lacy, ornate creatures. Just a couple of black cherry leaf miners. There's several larvae in this one leaf. Little green larvae that come out and spin cocoons just the size of sesame seeds. And then that's the adult Stigmella prunifoliella. These are so small that they routinely come through just the screens of the windows in our house and end up coming to our bathroom lights and stuff, or my desk lamp. And another equally tiny moth, that's 2 millimeters long. This is Coptodisca splendoriferella, and its larvae also mine in cherry leaves, and they are another one of these the family known as the shield bearer moths, that they cut out this little oval piece and attach it to a tree trunk with a little button of silk to make their cocoon. Okay, as Julia mentioned, Doug Tellamy says, and we agree, that if you could just plant, if you only have space for one tree in your yard, it should be an oak tree. There are more species of caterpillars by far on oaks than any other tree. There are more species of leaf miners on oaks than on any other tree. I think Makita leaf miners on oaks has 150 couplets or something like that. But another thing about oaks is gall wasps. There are 1,000 species of oak-specific gall wasps in North America, and each one actually makes 2 different galls, one in the spring and one in the fall, and it's on a particular part of a particular kind of oak. So they all insert their eggs in whatever plant part, in this case, a leaf. I'm just going to show you 2 of the galls, the wasp oak wasp galls from our yard. This one, these just erupt from the midribs of leaves, and they have these little nubbins on them that has recently been shown that these are like little nutritional packets to attract ants. And these are deciduous galls that drop to the ground, and then the ants drag them to their nests to eat the little nubbin, and then the gall is the larva inside the gall is in a safe place to overwinter. And then these little fuzzy ones also erupt from the midribs of red oak leaves. This is not a gall, but it's another distinctive feature you can see on oak leaves. This is the work of a leaf rolling weevil, and unlike the caterpillar leaf rolls I showed earlier, there's no silk involved here. It's just origami, basically, where this little black weevil with 2 red spots has made 2 cuts that meet on a vein. Often it's meeting in the midrib, and then it lays an egg there and rolls the leaf up into this neat little cylinder, which sometimes it leaves hanging like that, and sometimes it bites it off and drops to the ground. And that's the food for its offspring. Just the larva eats out the dead tissue on the inside of the roll. And our last tree is a quaking aspen tree. This is another one that just blows in on the wind. Willow and aspen are in the same family, and they share many of the same insect herbivores. A willow is another, if you could only plant one shrub in your yard, a native willow would be a great choice. I recently wrote a blog post about all the neat bugs that were just on a single individual willow we had planted in our yard. But maybe the most striking of all the leaf miners is this one on aspen, Philicnistus populiella. That's what the adult looks like. And then there's one last insect that feeds on both willow and aspen. It lays this beautiful spiky egg on the tip of the leaf. Then the caterpillar starts eating on either side of the midrib, and as it poops, instead of just dropping it to the ground, it ties it with silk to make this extension on the midrib. So that's where the midrib actually ends there. And it's called a frass chain, and the caterpillar rests there, and apparently ants that are looking for prey don't want to run out onto a poop stick to grab a caterpillar, so they're safe out there. And then in the fall, they switch to eating on either side of the petiole, and they lay down a bed of silk just like the swallowtail caterpillars do. And they also wind silk around the petiole and the stem, as the spice bush swallowtails do, which results in the leaf riding out the winter attached to the twig, and that the caterpillar is just hanging out frozen inside of that curled leaf through the winter. In the spring, they keep eating aspen or willow leaves, and they look like bird poop. And then their chrysalis also looks like bird poop. And then the adult looks like a monarch, but this is actually the viceroy that's just looking like a monarch, so birds won't eat it, thinking that it's toxic. And I ended with that so that we sort of came full circle back to the monarchs. And with that, we'll be happy to answer any questions. And you can also check out, Julia has a blog that she hasn't updated too recently, but it chronicles some of the stuff we did in our yard. And then my bug tracks blog talks about some of these bugs in more detail. All right.
All right, that was wonderful. This is Mary, and I think I'm in charge of trying to summarize the questions that people have been putting in the chat. So, first question, how large is your property?
We have 13 acres, but about 1 acre is yard and the rest is forested.
And it's maybe a little less than an acre because that also include the kind of nut orchard part.
Yeah.
There's sort of this scrappy edge of the yard that we haven't talked about where we planted all the nut trees and we call it the nut orchard. But the actual lawn part with maybe, I mean, the footprint, including the house, is maybe 3/4 of an acre.
Yeah. Okay. So you have forest all around that. Do you think those of us who are in the city, if we just stopped mowing our lawns, we would get as exciting a variety of things coming in as you did?
You probably, depending on how close you are to any natural habitat, you probably would want to supplement with some native plantings to kind of jumpstart it. Would be an interesting experience. I mean, with some of these things like milkweed and aspen and goldenrod will float for miles on the wind. So you may well have some of them coming in, but you probably will get more non-native weeds coming in than we have in our yard.
Mhm.
And we
Okay,
didn't talk about seed collecting really, but that's an option for if you don't have naturalized areas near you, you could collect seed from natural places as long as it's not a rare plant and you follow like sustainable harvest guidelines. So take like less than 10% and don't take from the first plant you see. You could collect a small amount of seed and use that. And I think, like I said earlier, for establishing in a lawn without pulling up the sod or smothering it or some other technique like that, I think I would start those seeds in a container and then transplant them.
And there might be, I mean, not all conservation areas will necessarily be happy about you collecting seeds, but a power line corridor is a great guilt-free place to collect seeds because they're just going to mow it all down sooner or later anyway. So.
uh-huh.
And some seeds do need to be cold stratified. So if you, well, most really, if you're going to collect seeds in the fall, you'd need to put them like in an envelope in your refrigerator over the winter, or else they probably won't germinate.
Got it. Okay. There were a number of questions about leaf litter. Some people said, so do you just leave leaf litter? Do you ever judiciously move it off of some plants in the spring? And what about around your fruit trees? Do you need to move the leaf litter, or do you need to edit out some plants that have planted themselves in? So that's 3 questions in one.
So sometimes we do move leaf litter if it gets to be very thick in a particular area and we're trying to have plants coming up there. Best practices around fruit trees, if you're worried about certain types of pests, maybe plum curculio or things like that, is to rake around your fruit trees. Try to minimize those pests without using any kind of pesticide. And what was the third question?
Oh, so that led me to thinking about under fruit trees, if you're just letting things sort of blow into your yard and plant themselves, do you edit them out around the fruit trees? And
Oh,
with
we
what
do.
you said about the sumac, for example, my guess
Right.
is, yeah, you,
So we keep a very small, like maybe 2-foot area with mulch around the fruit trees, but
Like wood chip
mulch.
uh-huh.
But basically, even if there's some small herbaceous plants, we just let them be there.
We basically we let them grow all year. By the end of the year, it's pretty thick with vegetation, but we try to clear just that small area around them, and
Basically for the vole control more
Yeah.
than any kind of competition concerns.
Got it. Okay. I'm seeing some more questions come up that remind me of one I had. Do you have any concerns with ticks? I've had people tell me they don't want to just leave tall grasses in their yards because of ticks. And now that you have a little one that's going to be running around out there, what are your thoughts on that?
So for a living, I'm a field biologist, so I'm in the woods all the time, and I feel like there are fewer ticks in our yard than many places I go, and we hardly ever see deer ticks. There are just briefly in the spring, there can be a lot of dog ticks sometimes, but neither of us has ever had Lyme disease. We just check for ticks regularly. We also, I mean, there are these wide mowed paths, so it's not like we're brushing against the dense vegetation all the time.
Got it. Got it. I'm seeing a comment that there's research out of Yukon that some non-natives like barberry host ticks, and so that's another good reason to get rid
Yeah,
of that.
I've heard about that research, but I feel like that's I mean, ticks like dense vegetation, and there are places where there's so many deer that they've just eaten everything except the barberry, and lots of deer ticks are correlated with lots of
Got it.
deer.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how close the relationship between ticks and barberry is, but
Right. Yeah.
cutting down the deer numbers
Right. Get rid of,
is-
yeah, reduce.
would be a good way to go in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Let's see, I had a question about how the neighbors react. Do you have close by neighbors? Are you pretty much free to do what you want on your?
We have, so we have that arborvitae hedge that came with the yard, so no one hardly sees our yard walking by actually, but we also on either side, there's a big pasture on one side and there's a little bit of trees between us and the next neighbor to the other side. So we're.
But one strategy I would say is if you can keep your edges looking clean. So if you mow paths or something and you edge between your wild meadow and your like path area, that's helps present your wildness as intentional, not like I've just neglected this entirely. So
We also have a kind of beauty strip along our driveway of more traditional perennial flowers that were almost all of them were something plants that our neighbor across the road was just thinning out her perennial beds, and we planted them there. So it looks
and many of
respectable.
there's a
when you're
bunch of
passing
native
by.
plants mixed into that too, but yeah. So like kind of sprucing up the edges maybe helps. And we have another friend with a wild meadow, and having signage to help show everyone that you intend to do this.
Yeah, just
can
a
help.
sign that says wildlife habitat can go a long way.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have a certain mowing regime for what you do mow? Do you just?
We basically, I mow the paths that we walk regularly, and then I feel like the rest of it, I mean, we've been using a weed wrench to pry out the trees that come in, and with some of it we haven't mowed in a few years really. We probably will try to this spring. But one strategy we've thought about is, people ask like, what's the best time of year to mow and to not be disturbing insects, and the truth is that you're always going to be disturbing something. I mean, there are bugs overwintering in the stems and in the leaf litter, and then if people talk about no mow May, which means you're mowing in June when everything's super active. So one strategy would be to mow, like have one part that you mow in the spring and another part that you mow in the fall, or just kind of what we do is basically at random when we feel like it. That seems to work out.
But not all at once, because you want to leave a refuge
Right.
for some of
Yeah.
you.
And because we're surrounded by a natural habitat, it's sort of less critical in our case, but definitely if you had a more isolated oasis that you were creating, you wouldn't want to mow the whole place at once.
Got it. Okay. I think I have time for maybe one more question. You showed us a lot of pictures of insects in what didn't look like seriously hollow stems to me, and I knew that I was supposed to let hollow stem goldenrod stand, but I wasn't too worried about the ones that had pithy stems. But maybe insects can use everything?
Well, so those pithy stem things are those small carpenter bees make the tunnels, and then all of these other bees and wasps reuse their old tunnels. So yeah, the pithy stem things like sumac and brambles and elderberry are great for all of those things. But the stems that are naturally hollow are also great too.
Charlie and Julie, I want to thank you folks for amazing photographs, beautiful information. And it sounds like your yard would be a thrilling place to visit, whether you're a bee, a mite, or a human, or a leaf miner, or a whatever. And that we've learned a lot of what we can do in our yards to make them more friendly. So thank you, thank you. And it's hard on a Zoom call to give clapping, but thank you so much. And also thank you, Elizabeth and Mary, for your work on the pollinator corridor. And so thank you all for coming. It's been fabulous. And thank you all for working with us and helping build native habitat everywhere.
Barren.